Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk to you about the two phases of scientific communication. This is the video that I've promised way back when, the video about the difference between a scientific paper and a scientific press release. So we're going to be discussing this sociological topic, you might say, the interactions of scientists between themselves and the society and all that good stuff. So here I wish to utilize the image, the mythological figure that Bruno Latour, whom I've mentioned quite a lot previously, utilized in his book Science in Action. It's a really good image. And in particular, it's an image of the god Janus, like the ancient Roman god. You probably know that so it's basically like a mythological king of the whole Latium region where Romans supposedly originate from. So it's a pretty, important figure. It was at some point considered, or at least supposedly considered, again, in the Jesuit version of history and mythology, like a head god of Romans in the first place. But later he was obviously substituted with Jupiter and people like that. Not people really, but gods. But anyway, so it was a pretty important god. That was my point. And it's like one of his main properties, it seems to be at least, is that it's a two-faced god. It's like a head, with two faces, like facing in the opposite directions, quite literally. So one head, or at least one face, is like a face of an old man who looks into the past, like an old man with a beard, etc., with wrinkles. And the other face is the face of a young person, a young boy essentially, looking into the future. So it's like Janus is like a gateway between the past and future, or something like that. He's like a god of doors and keys, etc. And it is said that when Romans went to war, they've left the doors into the temple of Janus open and only closed them when the war was over, and all the soldiers must have passed through the temple itself, etc. So it was a pretty important deity. And by the way, the month January is called after Janus. It's like a gateway from the previous year to the next year, again, from the past to the future, something like that. Or you might actually find a lot of similar imagery elsewhere. Like I keep thinking about those, double-headed serpents of Aztecs, like basically a snake, but without a tail. Instead of a tail, it has another head, It's like two heads facing in the opposite directions with a snake in between them. Or you might think about the Kekrops, this mythical Greek figure who was depicted as a man, sort of in like a mermaid form, it's like a torso of a man and the face of a man and arms, etc. But instead of his legs, he had those two snakes, basically. Something like that. And perhaps you might say this imagery was inspired by all these, plasma phenomena, astronomical phenomena of the past. If you feel like a bit Velikovskian-ish or Piratian-ish or something like that. But anyway, that was such a huge digression right at the beginning. It's ridiculous. But anyway, so yeah, let's talk about articles and press releases. So so we've talked about the figure of Janus that I'm going to utilize later, which Latour also utilized. But let's at first, I'm just gonna bring the main point is that the scientific results, that the results of a scientific study, they have almost literally two different emanations. And one emanation is like ad usum dolphini, using this Latin phrase, which means that they're like cleaned up, they're like for our own people, you know, they're adapted for the selected few, so to speak. And this is in particular scientific paper. It's like the most important type of scientific communication since, like, I don't know, early 1700s or something like that. And where like science really kicked off. And we have a second emanation of scientific communication, like the reporting of scientific results, let's say, which is the, well, it's aimed at the public or the media, and it's obviously like more modern thing in this sense, right? Because, well, before like late 1800s, there weren't really a, you know, a mass society or something like that, or you know, mass media. It's really a pretty novel invention, obviously, I mean, brought forth by the industrialization and urbanization and things like that. But anyway, it's very relevant for today. So this second way of communication is press release, and so we have all these, you know, press releases, let's say, on the sites of institutions or whatever, literally like their local newspapers or something like that. But obviously today everything is happening on the internet, let's say. So we'll talk mostly about that. And then we have those institutional websites or whatever publishing those press releases, and we have the aggregators, like, I don't know, whatever sites like Science Daily or phys.org or whatever, who kind of gather these press releases, you know, and like maybe slightly modify them or whatever. But it's a really big thing today, you know, like the absolute majority of scientific news seep into the society through these large aggregators. So it's a big thing again. And okay, so we have those two different types of communication, a scientific paper and a press release, right? And I would say that the key difference between them is that in the scientific paper, the message is that something along the lines that, you know, the work is done and everything pretty much fits the existing paradigm, or something to that effect. Like maybe not exactly, maybe not perfectly, maybe we should introduce new objects, like new processes, new possibilities, but they wouldn't contradict the existing paradigm, and they would explain everything that we have found. This is the basic idea of any scientific paper today. Well, like the absolute majority of them anyway. So, and even if we don't really know something, we'll figure it out pretty soon. Like we're on the right path. Like just wait for a bit. In half a year, we're gonna publish another paper, or we'll definitely kind of tackle the problem properly. While the press release tells a completely different story. It says, like, it emphasizes all the unknowns, you know. It sort of like kind of emphasizes this unfinished character of the research, so to speak. It introduces sometimes a lot of new hypotheses and even criticizes the existing models, existing paradigms even sometimes. And so in a press release, you always have this idea of, you know, scientists being humbled or baffled by the new discoveries that they've made, like almost by accident most of the time, or something to that effect. So yeah, and the results are always put forth as amazing, unexpected, you know, problematic, something like that. So maybe, like, kind of making a couple of steps ahead, or rather back, I should have said, maybe we can actually say that this is the another thing that the mass society, like mass media, has brought is this constant need of amazement or something like that, or amusement also, right? Amused to death, you know, something like that. So yeah, it's definitely a thing. But anyway, it's a really clear pattern where a paper states one thing and a press release states the other thing, or at least I hope I've been able to make it clear to you. And there are really a lot of examples of that. Like really, you can take any press release and trace the paper back. Thankfully, a lot of all those aggregators actually publish the links to the original study. Sometimes they do it like covertly somewhere along the text, but if you find it, or at least if you search for the name of the researcher and the institute and whatever else info, you can most of the time find the source paper. But anyway, so I was too lazy to search for the actual, you know, examples, and it would be perhaps too personal or something. It would be like an attack on somebody, although it might have been quite interesting, I mean. But I decided to just, you know, make something up completely. So I have this example here, which I'm gonna read to you because I can't really remember this amount of info. So imagine you're reading a paper. So that would be like chronologically the first step. The paper appears first and then it's transformed into a press release. So a paper might sound like something like that, or rather an abstract of this paper. And by the way, maybe I should make another digression here. Like I was thinking about maybe of making like a small guide of how to read a scientific paper, because, well, we'll talk about that later, but many people kind of neglect doing that. And kind of rightfully so. If you're not a scientist, if you're not doing any kind of research, you don't really need to read papers. But sometimes you do need to do that. Like if something really bothers you, if something's really important to you. So my idea of how you should read a paper is roughly this. So, well, firstly, obviously, you search for relevant titles or something like that, or keywords, and then firstly, you read abstract of the paper, because an abstract is like a surface of the paper. So a paper contains a lot of things, but you don't know what they are unless you kind of dive into it. But you're not sure if you even need to dive into it, because, well, how would you know if something relevant is inside of it, right? So you look at the surface first. If the surface gives you signs that something interesting is inside, then you dive in. So an abstract, it's like a surface. So you read abstract first. Like, thankfully, it's more or less short, like a couple of paragraphs usually, right? So you read an abstract first. You get an idea of what they're dealing with in this particular study, what their results are, etc., etc., and if you want more information, and most of the time you would, then you read conclusions first, actually. I mean, not the first, but after an abstract. Because conclusions are kind of the same thing as an abstract, but in a more detailed form. Like a lot of things that they don't include in abstract, they are contained in conclusions. If you encounter any terms that you're not aware of, that you're not familiar with, either in abstract or conclusions, then you go to the introduction. That's where usually most of the terms are introduced. And if you're interested in more details, you go to the body of the paper itself. So that would be my, let's say, walk through reading a scientific paper. You read an abstract, then you read the conclusions for more details, then you read, or maybe you can even skip the conclusions if you don't understand what abstract is saying. You go straight to the introduction, and then, only then, you read all the materials and methods and results, all those standardized sections, or however the author decided to split their paper. So yeah, basically abstract, conclusions, then introduction, and then the body of the paper. Or maybe you can exchange the last two, the introduction and the body. Well, that depends on your own level of awareness of this particular problem, etc., etc. Well, that's another huge digression anyway. So here's my example of an abstract, and then I'll give you an example of a press release based on this abstract, all right? So, okay, the abstract of the paper might look like something like this. It is known that the diffusion of sepulchres in subcritical regime leads to nonlinear response and the formation of quasi-periodic structures. Reference 1. In the present work, we show that the presence of nanoparticles of heavenly manna-doped iridium catalyst leads to a resonant plasmon absorption in the band gap region, which seems to arise due to quantum Hall effect. This might find applications in the creation of subatomic wave dehydroxylators of a new type. And the reference 1 is evidence for sepulchre diffusion in suboptimal regime near criticality transition. Author E.th.ph et al., Cyrillic letters B, 1997, volume 14, number 88, pages 243, 249. By the way, I'll probably copy that to the description, or maybe post it as a comment under this video if you want to read it. And the press release will tell you something like that. Like, imagine you're reading Science Daily or phys.org or any other rubbish resource like that, and you'll read something like this, like, imagine you're going to work in the morning. In the crowded subway, you're trying to get to the exit. If you exchange people for sepulchres, particles with propelepsy equal to 1, this is exactly how a subcritical nonlinear medium through which sepulchres are diffusing would look like. Scientists have long tried to solve the missing sepulchres problem, and now, it seems, new findings make the problem even more mystifying. We've studied sepulchres for more than a year now. Initially, nothing special happened. But one day I came to my laboratory, looked into a microscope, and saw these incredible patterns resembling contours of my graduate student's face, says Professor S. Spiderman, principal investigator at the Laboratory of Spatial Inversion of the University of North-South Dakota. And the patterns were changing in time. We were astonished. Nobody thought that sepulchres might behave in this manner, he adds. It turned out that the reason for these new observations were that somebody accidentally added heavenly manna-stained iridium dust, which is usually utilized for dinosaur removal. But the exact details of the processes involved are still unknown. Usually, sepulchres are quite inert. The fact that they form structures is hard to explain with the current models, as B. Atman from the Hippocrates Institute of Applied Fleaworth comments the results of Spiderman's group. Although we don't really understand our results, it opens up new avenues of research in sepulchology, Spiderman himself enthusiastically adds. The results of his work are accepted for publication in the next issue of Advances in Condensed Does It Matter Physics. So you clearly have two very different messages here. Hopefully I was able to show you something to that effect. So the first message is really like this, as I've already described, this old face of Janus, this old and wise man who is not really surprised. I mean, the scientific paper. He's not really surprised, and he's able to fit new results that he acquired somehow with using this, previous reference from E.th.ph. But the second case is completely different. Like, we have this other face of Janus, this young boy who doesn't really know anything, who's like clueless about the world, and like he's, thrown into the world, this geworfen of Martin Heidegger, and like Heidegger himself, he's like, you know, he makes a sour look on his face, and like he was awakened from this eternal coma, and he's like, let me sleep in my metaphysical dream. While this boy, I'll probably make a video about Heidegger and Hegel sometime after. I'm not sure about that. I don't really want to, but maybe I would. So this boy is amazed, you know. He's like very enthusiastic, but at the same time humbled, you know, by his cluelessness. In the second case, I mean. So he is sort of like inspired and confused at the same time, you know, something like that. So we have here, kind of concluding this segment, two different stories, fundamentally. And by the way, look up my video, Nature of Knowledge, if you want to know about, if you want to know more about the nature of knowledge, basically, that it's just a bunch of stories that we tell each other. So from the same fact, the same study that has been made by someone, we have those two different interpretations, if you like, two different stories. And as I've again stated in my video, Nature of Knowledge, the stories might differ by their narrator, listener, and actors. Well, in this case, actors are sort of the same. Sort of, not exactly, but kind of. So the factual basis is the same. Those are the actors. But we have still narrator and listener, and they differ very much in those two different situations. In the situation of a paper and a press release. So in the situation of a paper, we have a specialist, a narrator, talking to his colleagues, the listeners. So they're kind of in the same playground, so to speak. And the specialist tells them, his colleagues, like, look what I've done. And like, well, here's what I have done, and let me explain this to you. Like, I have a theory, like I have a way of explaining this without ruining our own meta game, so to speak, that we play with you, you know, our scientific community, basically. And you have to award me for that, you know, I've done a cool thing. Here's my paper, here's my results. That's what he says, basically. And in the second case of a press release, we have this sort of clueless person fighting the unknown and telling the various political parties, again, treating the word political in a very broad sense, meaning everything like institutes, administrations, entrepreneurs, whatever, any entities with power, basically. So he kind of shrugs and tells them, well, I'm smart, perhaps, but I'm even maybe smart enough to tackle this problem, but it's kind of too hard, so maybe you'll send me more resources, you know, send me more money, send me more whatever, more employees, more, you name it, something like that. So, again, yeah, two very different problems. And in some sense, you might say an analogy of sort of like generals in an army might fit here, or maybe colonists, people who were sent to colonize faraway lands. So there is a very big difference between how generals talk to each other and those colonists talk to each other, and how they talk to their chiefs, you know, the higher command or their kings who sent them to colonize those lands. In between each other, they would like compete and like, you know, kind of taint each other or something. Like taunt is the right word, I guess. Like, haha, you were an idiot. Look at what I'm doing. I'm much better than you at commanding my troops or whatever. I'm sorry. But to their superiors, they would like be humble and say, well, please, we're dealing with troubles, but I promise you, like, we're gonna bring the enemy down, we're gonna find the treasure, we're gonna do whatever, just send us more resources, you know. So again, it's a very different type of message, very different type of story, because both the narrators and listeners are different, you know. Narrators are different, even though like factually they're the same. I mean, it's the same general talking to the other general, but they don't represent themselves as the same in this situation, and the situation when the same general talks to the high command, you know. So it's like the perspective is very different anyways, right? And as I've said already, even narrator doesn't exist outside the story, right? So the story itself kind of creates a narrator as just one part of the whole picture. Okay, so we have this game of interpretations here, where this press release is full of those baffling, unexpected stuff, and paper is full of, you know, stuff well described by the theory, apparently at least. And the press release asks for money and support, whereas the paper shows that the author is actually already a winner. You know, he already has a priority. He already conquered this piece of land, this new colony, this new segment of the unknown to which he boldly, I don't know, thrown himself, or something to that effect. So, which story is true from these two? Because, well, they're like mutually exclusive. Well, again, you might say none, because again, they directly contradict each other. Or you might say both, because, well, they just can coexist. Again, if you adopt my way of looking at things, which I've described in more detail in this Nature of Knowledge video, they're just different stories, again. And they, once again, underline the thing that I've talked about quite a lot in my pseudoscience video, that the importance of politics in science. Again, politics in the broad sense of the word. Like, I understand by politics the decision making in the situation of the conflict of interests. So we have here roughly something like that. So the idea that we can even have this pure truth seeking in science is just false on all accounts. It's just not happening. It's not only just, let's say, construction of the world. You might say naively, like figuring the world out, but it's more like construction, really, and power somewhere outside of that. It's both power and construction of the world. They're inseparable fundamentally. Okay, hopefully this is more or less clear. Now, in the next segment, I wish to discuss this thing that I've already mentioned, that Latour himself actually uses Janus differently, the same mythological image. In particular, he actually, vice versa, like in contrast to my statement, he says that a wise head of Janus is turned to the public, and this clueless head, this young boy's head, is turned to the scientific community, whereas I state the opposite. Well, I should say that the same tendency that Latour mentions definitely exists, and in my videos about pseudoscience and the cult of Einstein and Hawking and science and anarchy, I've talked about it quite a lot, about this tendency, the tendency of only like propaganda seeping out, leaving the scientific community, and all the problems being contained inside of the scientific community, right? But again, this is an opposite tendency to what I'm talking about right now in this particular video. And in order to sort of draw a line between those tendencies, to distinguish them, I wish to introduce another entity that I would call degree of universality. And it's just an additional property of a story which would help us to distinguish those two tendencies, hopefully at least. And in particular, what I'm talking about with regards to this degree of universality is the local story. So the degree of universality is really low for what I'm talking about. It's really a localized study in some field of science. It doesn't have a pretense of being universally applicable or even be universally relevant. It's just something pretty small and localized. Whereas what Latour talks about is like scientific truth in general. So it's by definition like very universal, right? So this degree of universality that I'm proposing here for consideration is much higher in the case of what Latour is talking about. So I would propose like a simple scheme with 4 distinct layers of communication. I know this video is only called 2 phases of communication, but in this sub-segment of it, I would propose 4 layers of communication. Again, depending on the story itself that we're talking about, and depending on the degree of universality, which is like a small property of this story, right? But it's important in this particular distinction between my and Latour's ideas. So the first layer would be a scientist, a narrator, talking to another scientist, a listener, about their work, the work of the first one, or vice versa, it doesn't really matter. And that would be a local story. Or rather, okay, let's consider the universal story first. So that would be a universal story if those scientists, okay, I've completely messed everything up. So the first layer, let's say, would be a scientist talking to another scientist about the problems in science, let's say, even in their field or in science in general. And in this case, it would be a universal story, right? Because, well, they're saying, well, this model of whatever, like this theory of relativity or quark model or whatever, they don't seem to work. Like, what do we do with that? Like, let's think about it. So that type of communication. Then the second type of communication, I would say, would be a scientist talking to another scientist. So narrator and listener are the same, more or less, but about the particular study, about the, let's say, a work of one of those scientists. And that would be a local story, right? Because it's really localized. It's only about a particular study. Then the third possibility would be, let's say, a scientist talking to a journalist or a manager, like entrepreneur, whatever, or administrator, about their work, the scientist's work. And this would also be a local story, because again, it's about this particular work, right? It's not about science in general, like what are we going to do with our science or something like that. And there's a fourth possibility where a journalist, or let's say a scientist who is like a popularizer of science or something like that, talks to the general public, including perhaps, all those managers and whatever. But the important thing is that it's like the message is anonymous. It's for everyone. And that would be another universal story if they talk about the science in general, or some field of science or something like that. So in this category, we might place all the, educational material, all the popular science books, videos, texts, whatever, blogs. So that would be also a universal story. And so let's examine quickly those four that I've mentioned. So the first one, where scientists talk to each other about the problems of science or the problems of their particular field, it's usually not even documented, you know. It's usually just a verbal communication, let's say like a short comment at some conference or defense of a thesis or whatever, or it just happens in corridors, you know, when scientists just talk one-on-one, you know, kind of in a very honest manner, like etc. So I mean, when they're sure that no one is listening, etc. So yeah, it almost is not present in the mass media, let's say. Now the second type is what I've mentioned, is that scientists talk to each other about the research of a particular scientist, of let's say a scientific paper. So again, a paper or like a conference proceedings or even a presentation at a conference or something like that would be a good example of that, right? Then the third thing that I've mentioned is that when a scientist talks to journalists or managers about their work, that would be press release, again, the thing we're talking about in this video. And the fourth thing would be what is called popular science. It's when a journalist or popular scientist talks to whatever anonymous public. And again, that also kind of includes, you know, university textbooks and things like that, because it's sort of the same thing. Yeah. So, and yeah, well, I probably should have mentioned that obviously there exists some transitional forms of scientific communication, like, well, a couple of examples, like maybe you might think of press conference with scientists. So here you have all the traits of everything but the first thing. So you have traits of scientist to scientist local communication, scientist to journalist local communication, and journalist to public universal communication. But you don't have scientist to scientist universal communication. You don't discuss problems of science or scientific paradigms at press conferences, right? It's a very different format. And the second example might be, well, I don't know, technical report, maybe, where you have both my point 2 and 3, which are scientist to scientist local communication and scientist to journalist or a manager local communication. So it's a report that is aimed at scientists and managers, right? So and a very localized report. It's not about the science as a whole. It's not about the scientific field as a whole. It's about some particular problem. All right, but again, obviously, we're not concerned with those transitional forms here. So Latour really considers the first and fourth points in this quasi-classification of mind. So he talks about scientist to scientist universal communication, so about problems of science in general, versus scientist or popularizer to society type of communication, which is also universal. So he talks about these two universal types of communication. I mean, talking about everything to your fellow scientists or to the society. So he says that to your fellow scientists, you acknowledge that there are problems, whereas to society, you just spread the propaganda. That's what he says. So we have clueless Janus inside of science and wise Janus outside of science, so to speak. Whereas I'm talking about 2 and 3 in my classification, which is local stories. Scientist to other scientists about their own research, and scientists to the society about their own research again, not about the science as a whole. And in this case, this Janus kind of turns 180 degrees, and wise Janus is facing inside science. It's like this particular scientist claims to be the best among the community, claims to be the wise, whereas to the society he presents himself as this, you know, almost like autistic idiot savant who needs care and money, you know. So he's this fighter of dragons versus an idiot who needs care, depending on the circumstances, on who is he talking to, basically, which again underlines the crucial role of politics and power. That's what I'm talking about fundamentally. So yeah, so it is absolutely understandable that in one case he says that we can explain everything to his fellow scientists, but to the society he says, please help, you know, because it's in his interests. They would be interested if they would be amazed, you know, again, returning to the thing I mentioned at the beginning. And at the same time, they might give him more money because they would be interested, because, well, if he says that it's an unknown thing, then people would, you know, be more kind of prone to, I don't know, I guess reduce the amount of unknown. And since they already have an agent to reduce this unknown, they would supply him with resources or something like that. Where by agent, I mean this particular scientist. Okay, so it is in his interests to be constantly baffled, you know, in those press releases for the public. And it's an interesting thing that, you know, various pseudoscientists, again, see my video about pseudoscience, read only press releases most of the time, like the absolute majority of the time. And they almost like maniacally search for these mentions of, you know, failing models, or of the evil mainstream science, you know, how mainstream science cannot explain anything, you know, etc., etc. So they basically de facto confuse all those four types of communication, or at least two that I've already mentioned in my, I mean, two in the more simple form, and obviously they find plenty of evidence, you know, plenty of examples of this constant bafflement, because, well, as I've said, it's the point of press release to show bafflement and the problematic character. I'm sorry. In order to gain more resources, right? So that's the whole point. But they don't even acknowledge that. I mean, those pseudoscientists who do all these searches. So it only shows their naivety about this political aspect of science that I keep mentioning over and over in all my videos about science. And it's actually also shows, well, not so much, but the same type of naivety is also characteristic of mainstream scientists, you know. They are usually not even aware of anything political, which is kind of funny, because these, you know, pseudoscientists, they often claim that the results, let's say, of scientific experiments or scientific theories are fudged because of politics. Well, it's like, it's very stupid that they acknowledge the existence of politics in science on one occasion when it fits their own interests, but they can completely ignore the existence of political aspects in science on all the other occasions. It's just ridiculous. It's very naive. It's either stupid or malevolent. It's one of the two things, basically. So yeah, so this philosophical naivety is unfortunately a scourge hopefully that's the right word, like of both the mainstream scientists and pseudoscientists. And yeah, you know, like, ignorance has always been something I excel in, followed by naivety and pride. I completely sucked at it, but it's one of my most favorite songs, and it seems relevant to this statement. Okay, so let's go to the conclusions, I think. So what we're talking about is that basically scientists tell one story in a scientific paper, which the story is roughly like, we found something and we can explain it to you, okay? It's obviously for the other members of the scientific community. And almost diametrically opposed story in the press release, which is for the public. And this other story is something like, we found something and we have no idea what to do with it. And so it might be described, or at least I've tried to describe it, with these two faces of Janus, this idea that I've stolen from Bruno Latour. And the difference in these two messages arises from political aspects of knowledge that have in quite a lot of detail ruminated upon in my videos about pseudoscience, about the cult of Einstein and Hawking, science and anarchy, and even perhaps potential energy and other dark matters. I don't quite remember what I talked about back then. Yeah, so it's all political, these political aspects which are ignored by both mainstream scientists and pseudoscientists, right? So the message depends on to whom and why are we talking, what goal are we trying to achieve with the message. And again, it's funny that, you know, this famous quote from Bacon, you know, scientia potentia est, science is knowledge. Like, well, here it is, like, the quote is like 400 years old. Science is knowledge. I mean, damn, science is power, or knowledge is power. So the power is inseparable from science, from knowledge, right? So it would be naive to consider that it's only knowledge that gives you power, but power cannot, you know, creep back and kind of dominate the knowledge itself. Well, yeah, it should, and it does. That's my point. So so both paper and a press release concern local studies, whereas basically if we're talking about the universal message about all of the science, or the whole of certain area of science, this Janus should turn like 180 degrees and, like, you know, reverse his messages. So okay, that was pretty much the point of this whole video, and I would actually be very surprised if nobody has studied this question before, like the difference between a paper and a press release. Like, hopefully I've been able to more or less draw a basic scheme for interpreting this difference, and hopefully my example served you well. Maybe you've really saw all these basic patterns that you always see in both of those occasions. And so yeah, I would be really surprised if nobody yet has described this. And this essay on which this video is based upon is already 2 years old, and nothing, literally nothing, has changed in those 2 years. And I think in like the next 5 years the situation would be the same. And it was more or less the same in the previous like 10 years at least. you know, like you might say even 15 or 20 years, but back then the internet wasn't really as prominent as today. So I don't know. So yeah, I would be baffled, you know, as all those scientists, if there were no studies of this particular phenomenon. And I claim that this is a very typical and universal pattern, almost archetypal, you know, in some sense, but not really. I mean, I'm kind of joking here. It almost looks like some, you know, secret society, like prints those press releases, you know, using the same template or something. Or you might think about some phys.org recruiting their authors by forcing them to write like 100 of those press releases, and if they don't do it the way it should be done, so to speak, they don't get hired or something. Almost as if there is some, you know, press release death camp or something, where captured pseudoscientists are forced to write press releases for all these mainstream popular science aggregators, as again, Science Daily, phys.org, whatever, eureka.org. There's so many of them. Yeah. So if you want to write if you're looking for a cool topic for a PhD thesis in like sociology or of science, or just some general sociology, or maybe philology and linguistics, who knows? There you go. It's basically a thesis already there, you know. You just have to take my idea and like write it down in 100 pages, or how much are you required. So I'm giving it for free if anyone wants to work on it. Out of courtesy, you might call this Eugene effect or something like that. I don't know, maybe, but that's again up to you. So all this time that I was thinking about this topic, there was an analogy that I've had with a cell, a living cell. In particular, you know, a cell has to maintain homeostasis. And for doing that, in particular, one of the things that living cells do is they have to maintain, for example, the polarization of the membrane, of a cell membrane, right, to both transmit, like, let's say, signals and transmit whatever nutrients or whatever. So one of the things they do for achieving that is active ion transport, you know, by the gradient of concentration, spending some energy. In particular, like sodium goes out of the cell and potassium stays in, or even kind of pumped inside the cell, right? Even though there's already a lot of it and there's already a lot of sodium outside. So hopefully you get the analogy. Like a scientific community, or even a single scientist, might be represented as this sort of cell. It kind of transmits one type of message outside, which is like sodium, and it retains, keeps inside, or like uses internally this other message, which is potassium, so to speak. So I don't know what to do with it. Like, it's just an analogy I've like vaguely had, but I don't know. Maybe you can utilize it in your PhD thesis. But it goes to show that, again, all these power structures, they kind of behave in a similar manner, hopefully. But okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.